Nuclear proliferation. This is A.Q. Khan. He was accused by the U.S. of encouraging proliferation, particularly to Iran, of nuclear weapons. Now, his is an interesting case. A.Q. Khan is certainly not a racist. His wife was European. But he was a Muhajir, which are Muslims who come, they're spread all over South Asia, but when Pakistan was formed, they went from India back to Pakistan. They're probably the best educated and most cosmopolitan members of Pakistan society because they have international experience. So that tradition gave them a much broader view. Now, Pakistan has a difficult relationship with Iran because a large component of the intelligence network is made up of Pashtun. And so for identity reasons, Pashtuns and Persians just don't get along because of issues in, starting with Afghanistan. And because of differences between Sunnism and Shiism, between Persians and the Pashtun. So most Pakistanis don't see the nuclear weapon they possess as being an Islamic bomb. Although Pakistan is the homeland of Muslims, Pakistan has a South Asian perspective. Now, A.Q. Khan had a much broader vision, and he thought that Islamic civilization, broadly speaking, should have access to nuclear weapons, and that would reduce the interference of countries from the outside. And so he actively pushed the spread of nuclear weapons. And when you read my book, you'll see what his efforts were compared to similar effects by state-level policies in Pakistan as well as other countries. Now, what he discovered was that there was sufficient technical skill in the developing world to develop many of the components necessary for the critical technologies for nuclear weapons. And if you look at the graph on the right, you're going to see that we have here a centrifuge, and the parts for the centrifuge came from many countries in the developing world. Like South Africa, Dubai, Turkey, Malaysia. So you no longer had to go to a Western country and set up an espionage operation to steal technology. Now, he's known also as the father of the Pakistani nuclear weapons program because he did in fact steal the blueprints for the centrifuge while working in Europe and brought the technology to Pakistan and then participated in the nuclear weapons program to help Pakistan acquire nuclear weapons. But then he went in his own direction and was ultimately censured by the Pakistani state, which didn't approve of his sharing of technology with other countries. And there's a section in my book that you need to read that discusses his allies in Pakistan who had a similar vision. Here you can see the A.Q. Khan network and where he traveled and the contacts he made and how he assembled the technologies to be able to then extend the availability of that technology to other countries. Now, the critical question with proliferation is, what drives it? And what kind of world does it create? So the history of proliferation is basically the history of the technology spreading that then allows countries to build and test nuclear weapons. And we have, just a general idea that technology spreads naturally. It's an unavoidable diffusion as people learn how to make things, and it's very difficult to unlearn it. With the passage of time, more states are going to be able to build nuclear weapons. And you see here, the year of the atomic bomb acquisition in the US was 1945, and 7 years later, they had Ivy Mike, where they had their test of a thermonuclear weapon, 1952. USSR, in 1949, they had an atomic bomb, just a few years after the US, and then 1953, 4 years later, they got a fusion device. The UK was 1952, and then 5 years later, they had a fusion device in 1957. France, 1960, they had a fission device, and then 8 years later, 1968, they had a fusion warhead. China was 1964, and then very quickly, 3 years later, 1967, they had a fusion device. Israel probably had an atomic bomb by 1968, not a large number, perhaps just one. India, they did a peaceful nuclear explosive test to demonstrate their capacity, but they said it was for engineering, not military purposes. Pakistan got a bomb in probably around 1988 and then tested about 10 years later. South Africa got a bomb by 1980, North Korea by probably 1995. So we see here the transition from the atomic to the hydrogen bomb was pretty fast. And you can see here a chart that I've gotten from a book showing the transition in months between different major tests. And it's obviously a text written by an historian of the British nuclear weapons program attempting to boast that England had the most efficient program. And this is a very common type of analysis done by a lot of the nuclear writers. They try to argue that one country or the other was more efficient because of sort of critical management advantages. So the technical approach here predicts the gradual spread of nuclear weapons to most countries of the world. So here you can see the arsenals. This is November 2015. This is from the Military Balance, the International Institute of Strategic Studies. A text is available in the Concordia Library, and you can see the updates every year for the different types of warheads and bombers for the different kinds of countries listed. And here you can see where the nuclear weapons were in 2016. Again, I haven't updated it, but you can compare it. The Russians in 2016 at 7,300, not all of which were deployed. Some of those were in storage. The US at 6,900. And these are numbers that are much lower than they were during the Cold War. You can see France, China, the UK, Pakistan, India, Israel, and down to North Korea, which is a handful. And so you can see the nuclear powers deployed warheads for the US are actually much smaller than other warheads, which are ones that are in storage for a total inventory. So the US and Russia keep a large quantity of weapons in storage facilities, ready to be redeployed on missiles or mostly bombs that would go onto aircraft carriers and distant air bases in other countries, but are currently being kept in the US. And again, you can see here the nuclear reactors in different parts of the world, which basically give you an idea of where the technical skill lies in the energy field, and consequently, where we would expect people to have the technical skill. So in the early approach, in the spread of nuclear weapons, we have this sort of technical conception. It was argued that nuclear weapons would spread to states as they became capable of developing them, or at a minimum, the powers will develop the latent means to develop nuclear weapons on short notice, like Japan, where they have remarkable reprocessing capacity. They've got missiles, and they actually have a highly enriched uranium. Now, this approach would predict the continued and gradual spread of nuclear weapons and the latent ability to produce them. So it's just a matter of time before every country in the world can quickly build nuclear weapons, because they're going to have a critical mass of scientists and engineers that can do the project. So this approach argues that as uranium and plutonium inventories increase and the number of reactors and global enrichment capacity increases, so nuclear weapons become much easier to build, and the barriers to mass production of nuclear weapons are going to drop significantly. Here again you can see a list of where the reactors are in the world, including 104 in the US. And lower down on the list you can see Armenia, Netherlands, Romania, Slovenia, Mexico, Lithuania, Brazil, and their basis for building the technical skills to build nuclear weapons. Here were reactors added. This is about a 25-year-old chart. So for many countries here, like China, you can triple the number of reactors they're trying to add, and Japan is trying to cut down on the reactors. So this is a chart which shows the increase in latent capability, which is actually significant. You're looking at maybe a third of countries in the world could probably build nuclear weapons if they really wanted to. There are some countries that are seeking nuclear weapons, and this again is from 25 years ago, but the identities haven't changed much. Iran was looking for nuclear weapons at this time, and it's still looking for nuclear weapons. And you can see the nuclear states is fairly stable. So it's a bit of a paradox that latent capacity is shooting up, but the nuclear states are not. So we also have the ability to track total inventories. The world mined uranium total in the 1990s was about 15,000 tons. That's a lot. So it's difficult to track. World plutonium inventories, however, are easier to track because we know where the reactors are and we can estimate the amount of plutonium, and some countries do declare the amount of plutonium. So military plutonium is about 155 tons. That's it, the total global supply, of which Russia has a significant amount, 130 tons, and that was reduced to 95. There was actually a program sponsored by the US, which in the Yeltsin era was pursued, happily to basically denature the plutonium so it couldn't be used for military purposes and then buried in the ground. But Russia pulled away from this when Putin came in for obvious reasons. The US is 47 tons, China 4, Israel 0.56, the DPR 0.05 tons. We don't know what the French or the English have. Civilian plutonium is at 1740 tons, and it's growing by 70 tons a year. Right, and this is sometime in the 2000s. And you can update the sources every year. It's never regularly published, but you can build how much plutonium there is in the civilian world. Spent fuel is about 800 tons. Separated plutonium in stores 141 tons, and recycled plutonium is 49 tons. Here you can see a U.S. Trident sea-launched ballistic missile flying off into the sky. Now, these are states with active programs, both canceled and current. Sweden had a program in the 1950s, and I actually have my master's thesis at Concordia sitting in the library somewhere, which you could probably read and probably download it as a PDF, and I discuss each of these cases in my master's thesis, and then I ran a statistical test. So Sweden went for a bomb project, but ultimately came to negotiations with the US where it would get benefits of NATO protection and intelligence and other resources, and so the Swedes canceled their program. Egypt had a hopeless program in the 1960s. Libya went around and tried to buy a bomb unsuccessfully. Iran's program started under the Shah and then ended in the early Islamic State because it was seen as immoral and counter to Islamic law, and then re-emerged in the late 80s, early 90s when it became clear that Saddam was pursuing a bomb. Iraq started very early. Taiwan had 2 bomb projects in 75 and 85. The first one was to signal the Americans that their departure from Vietnam should not be coupled with a decommitment from protecting its Asian allies. And Taiwan did it again in 1985 to again signal the U.S. that it mattered, because that was a time when the U.S. was getting very close to China. Argentina and Brazil had military governments in the 70s and so flirted with getting a bomb. And that was entirely driven by military leadership paranoia, because once the civilian governments came in, those programs ended abruptly. However, in Brazil, it persists as a naval nuclear reactor program. In South Korea, again, there was both in 1975 and 1985, there were programs for almost the same reason as Taiwan, which was to basically compel the U.S. to stay. Otherwise, South Korea would find a Tarkic weapon of mass destruction to protect itself. The DPRK has been looking for nuclear weapons for a very long time, mostly unsuccessfully. It's been blocked by its Soviet and communist Chinese allies. But with the end of the Cold War, it was able to intensively develop the means with help from Pakistan. Algeria built a reactor, secretly put missile defense around it, and then an Islamic election derailed the government, resulting in a level of civil war, and the Algerians dismantled the reactor in response to pressure from France in exchange for weapons. Romania had a project where they took slivers of plutonium from Canada's Candu reactor illegally and then experimented in the lab. I think Ceausescu would have liked to bomb. He didn't have the technical skill. Syria has been trying since 1992, and then a couple of years ago they built a reactor which then got bombed by Israel. So what you see here are pictures of a U.S. Titan rocket being launched. You have the detonation over Nagasaki, and in the bottom right you have the dual-key U.S. West German Pershing I theater nuclear missile. So Germany did sort of have a bomb. The warhead was guarded by an American 19-year-old with a rifle, and the Germans had a plan to steal the bomb from under the guards that the Americans posted there. So the Germans had a weapon. The weapon, however, didn't have a range to go past Poland, because the Americans didn't want Germany to start a nuclear war with the Soviet Union in the middle of a war trying to keep the Soviets from getting to the Rhine. Now, a major methodological issue is how do you deal with alliances when they're sharing nuclear weapons? Almost every NATO country had access or control over U.S. nuclear weapons in the event of a nuclear war, and these included Germany, Turkey, Greece, Italy, Belgium, Holland, England, and Canada. Canada had nuclear weapons from 1963 to 1986. It was a big deal. In fact, the government of Diefenbaker fell because they wanted Canada to have nuclear weapons and the Liberals didn't, and so there was a vote of non-confidence, and that's how the Liberals got in. But when the Liberals got in, they then secretly brought in the nuclear weapons they voted against bringing in. And the nuclear weapons remained in Canada for a very long time. Most of them were warheads for the Bomark interceptor missile to shoot down Soviet bombers coming in from the Arctic, and air-to-air missiles. And those weapons remained until the conservative government of Mulroney came in, and he asked the question, do we have nuclear weapons? And the answer was yes, and he had them removed. And in 1986, Canada no longer had nuclear weapons. In fact, Canada's Bomark missile site, and you can see a Bomark at the Aviation Museum in Ottawa. The Bomarks were deployed at two sites, one of which is now the airport for Mont-Tremblant. So you go to the airport, that was not always an airport, it was a nuclear missile site right here in Quebec. So you can see on this chart a list of the different weapon systems and the countries that trained and had access to those weapons in time of war. And it's quite significant. And these were basically arranged with protocols that were signed between the US and these countries. And the US goal, of course, was to keep nuclear weapons from proliferating. A nuclear-armed Germany or a nuclear-armed Japan would have made relations very difficult between the US and other countries in the region. They would have gone nuclear as well, and this would have encouraged the Soviets to go nuclear. And the US wanted a world driven by commerce and prosperity and not local nuclear conflicts. You can see here US and allied nuclear programs of cooperation. You can see Canada had air-to-air missiles. It's curious that it doesn't list the surface-to-air missiles in Canada. Very curious. So it's not a complete chart. And a lot of these arrangements were sort of curious. They were not perhaps all declared. Here you can see other systems that had as their target to be shared with other NATO countries. You can see the Genie missile, which is the air-to-air missile that Canada operated to shoot down Soviet bombers. We've got there the Honest John. You've got there the Davy Crockett, the Jupiter missile, which is ultimately deployed in Italy and Turkey. Now, Brahma Chellaney is an Indian strategic analyst who made the observation that countries very frequently coordinate the development of their missile and their nuclear warhead programs so that they emerge at the same time. To have just a very large missile program can be provocative and basically alert the adversaries that you're going to build lots of nuclear warheads. And if you have a nuclear warhead but no missile system, you have no deterrent because you have no way of delivering the device, especially if you've configured it for missiles but not aircraft. Brahma Chellaney made the observation that India was probably maturing the technologies in coordination so that when one was ready, they could then mate the warhead with the missile. And in 1998, when India did test, it seamlessly was then integrated onto the Prithvi, which was India's first nuclear missile. Not a very long-range missile. It would be classified as a short-range missile, but these weapons were coordinated in their development and procurement seamlessly. Now you can see programs elsewhere. Parallel with Iraq's nuclear program was its work on a solid-fueled cold-launch missile. Iraq had purchased 819 Scud-Bs from the Soviet Union, including 11 tractor erector launchers, which are basically the trucks that carry them around and fire them. From these it developed and built 200 indigenous Al-Hussein missiles, as well as 80 specialized warheads. 55 were chemical and 25 were biological. Now ultimately Iraq had imposed on it an IAEA inspection protocol to stop it from building nuclear weapons, and its nuclear weapons program was dismantled in the early 1990s. Now the problem with the technical approach is that it just can't explain when states get rid of their nuclear weapons, or they stop their weapons programs like Argentina and Brazil, which happened when Argentina and Brazil civilianized their governments. The Republic of South Africa rolled back apartheid. It negotiated with other stakeholders in society. It dismantled its nuclear weapons, and in 1993, when apartheid ended in South Africa, they had no nuclear weapons. Ukraine, Kazakhstan, and Belarus gave up the nuclear weapons on their soil and had them sent back to Russia. The technical approach also cannot explain why there are so many states that could have built nuclear weapons but have chosen not to. And so to explain these cases, we have to focus instead on motivation as to why states build nuclear weapons, because clearly the technical ability is not creating large numbers of states building nuclear weapons. Here you see a sea-launched ballistic missile being launched from a U.S. submarine. Now this Regulus is really like an airplane rocket, and it sits in a garage hangar on top of the submarine. So this is an early nuclear missile launch platform in the U.S. Navy. So I developed a 4-variable motivational model. I looked at 99 cases of explicit and non-explicit decisions for or against nuclear development. I had 4 independent variables that you can see here: security, alliance, trade, and prestige. Security is basically under what level of threat is the country, and it has 3 basic measures, which is from existential threat to no threat. Alliance is overt alliance membership to a covert alliance or tacit alliance to no alliance support. Trade is the level of dependence on foreign trade, because states that develop nuclear weapons can be sanctioned, and this can be costly. And also the push in the domestic level to assert the prestige of the state, like India detonating the peaceful nuclear explosive in 1974, because India wanted to demonstrate technological viability to its own population. The government was under pressure to do that. And you'll see the negative values under MLE indicates that these are pressures not to build nuclear weapons. If a country has an alliance, it doesn't need nuclear weapons. If a country is heavily trade dependent, it'll pay costs if it goes and develops nuclear weapons. So it's primarily security that pushes countries to build nuclear weapons, and if there's a domestic push for prestige. So security is the most important incentive for building a nuclear weapon. 31 of the 62 cases that had a security problem undertook a positive proliferation decision, which means they chose to build nuclear weapons. It's the motive behind Pakistan's nuclear weapons program. States under a mild security threat will not necessarily build nuclear weapons, even if they are relatively isolated and without a formal alliance. Like Taiwan could have built a nuclear weapon, but chose not to because it would have imperiled its relationship with the U.S. Because if it was the only country with a weapon in the region, then there would have been pressure on Japan and South Korea, and that would have unraveled the U.S.'s alliance arrangements. Alliance effects represent disincentives to build nuclear weapons, either because of extended nuclear deterrence provided by an outside power or a regional state. So it's the most strong disincentive. The U.S. physical presence in South Korea is the main reason why South Korea doesn't have a nuclear weapon, although when the U.S. threatened to leave, the South Koreans hinted that they could develop nuclear weapons. Israel doesn't have much confidence in an alliance with Europe or the U.S., and so even if they had an alliance, it's very unlikely they would develop. They would withhold developing nuclear weapons. Trade acts as a disincentive in cases where an embargo can have a significant effect on a country's ability to trade. So it's probably a big reason why Germany and Japan rely instead on the nuclear arsenal for protection. Switzerland and Sweden have thought about nuclear weapons and have invested efforts in analyzing it. Sweden a lot more than Switzerland, but ultimately Sweden rolled back their program for precisely that commercial reason, and Switzerland, because the program was covert, just calculated it would be a bit of a problem since they were landlocked. Prestige is important. Argentina and Brazil were not really afraid of each other. I think they were competitively trying to show which society was more prestigious. So it's a very peculiar non-security motive for developing nuclear weapons. Now there are many exceptions. Exception number 1 is the exception of extreme threat. Both the British and the French in the Second World War were predicted to have developed nuclear weapons, but they didn't, because they didn't have the time horizon. France expected to be having to fight for its life within months, and the English devoted all of their resources to hold Hitler off. So the French passed their knowledge in a report to the English. The English fashioned a mod report and then passed it on to the U.S. And it's that report that was the key instigator for the American Manhattan Project that followed. The second exception is the perceptions of an absence of an available alliance, and this affects both Israel and North Korea, who don't believe they can find a reliable ally, and therefore have gone for their own nuclear arsenals. Now there are other cases of countries that are probably afraid of retaliation, and that could be Taiwan today, because Taiwan, if it were to build a nuclear weapon, would likely face sanction, if not attack, by China, which is relatively close. And China's warned that if Taiwan tries to build a nuclear weapon, China would respond. And Cuba. If Cuba were to go for its own nuclear weapon, it's likely the U.S. would cancel their promise not to invade. So what are the conditions for denuclearizing? I mean, when would a country get rid of their nuclear weapons? Number one, there has to be no apparent security threat to even secondary interests. So countries like Belarus and Kazakhstan, the Russians were leaving those countries at the time. So there was very little thought that these countries that they would be reinvaded by Russia. So they didn't feel insecure at all. Number two, that there exists some trade interdependence acting as an incentive and making the state aware of the effects of its neighbors of its military power. So South Africa, for example, because of the apartheid regime, it was under heavy sanctions, and they wanted to normalize the economy. And so getting rid of nuclear weapons enabled that. It allowed them to re-enter the world trading community. And the Ukraine, Kazakhstan, and Belarus were offered incentives, both from Russia and from the West, to give up their weapons. A third factor, which increases it, is that states with an alliance assurance are more likely to undertake this proliferation reversal. Now, Ukraine didn't have an agreement with either Russia or NATO, but they felt secure that Russia was not going to invade them. Now, the conditions to halt a program in the pre-testing and deployment threshold has the following conditions. Number one, the state's trade variable must show some international interaction. Number two, the security variable must not display threats beyond secondary interests. So the country might have a threat, but it can't be an existential threat. And three, the prestige variable must not be a major incentive. So India in 1966 canceled a nuclear weapons project that it had undertaken earlier. India is a very curious case of a country that twice planned a nuclear weapons program, canceled it, and then started it again for a third time. Argentina and Brazil got rid of their programs in 1991 with the withdrawal of the military governments. Algeria in 1991 withdrew their program after the beginning of their civil war. Indonesia in 1966 and Egypt in 1975 also canceled their programs, or rather canceled aspects of the programs, although they were frankly very low scale. This here is a Soviet M4 Bison bomber, which was a jet bomber then later replaced by the Blinder and the Tupolev 26 that I'll show you some other time. Opaque proliferation. Why do some states not declare their weapons programs? The classic example, of course, is Israel and its 80 boosted fission weapons. Number one, states can secure a level of security otherwise not possible without the avoidance of an arms race by relinquishing the use of nuclear weapons for overt declared deterrence. So by having nuclear weapons but not publicly declaring it, you avoid having to provoke your opponents into also building nuclear weapons. And India's decision not to declare its weapons in the 1990s was designed not to provoke Pakistan. The second variable is states may be pressured by larger allies from making a declaration of nuclear weapons possession. Israel was under a lot of pressure by the US not to declare nuclear weapons. If Israel declared nuclear weapons, the Arab states would devote a lot more resources to nuclear weapons, or the Soviets could provide weapons to some of the allies, like Syria, and it would complicate US entry into the Middle East. Now, there's a normative debate about proliferation between Sagan and Waltz. It's a very well-known debate, and they actually got together after writing a number of books, and they wrote a book jointly in which they debated each other, and it's really fascinating. Kenneth Waltz wrote a monograph called an Adelphi monograph for the International Institute of Strategic Studies in the 80s, in which he argued more may be better. He argued that the spread of nuclear weapons should be encouraged because nuclear weapons make war very costly, and the spread of nuclear weapons will make war much less likely. And his argument is basically the destructive effect of nuclear weapons is very easy to understand, and therefore as states have disputes, they become very careful. New nuclear powers, irrespective of their culture, will face the same constraints as the older nuclear powers, and so it enables them to learn restraint. Even countries like North Korea or Iraq. Now, Sagan disagreed. He said deterrence failure is possible because organizations operate out of routines and not out of rationality. And he refers to C.P. Snow's logic that the more nuclear weapons there are, it's just just that alone increases the higher probability of an accident. Here you can see a Soviet Delta III ballistic missile submarine. Now, anti-proliferation policies. The major powers have an interest in limiting the spread of nuclear weapons because it undermines their own ability to intervene and provide extended nuclear deterrence to their allies. Right? There are some exceptions, North Korea for China and Israel for the US. North Korea just doesn't trust China, and Israel doesn't want to stake its entire existence on fickle Western states because of its history of being victimized. The agreement between the US, the Soviets, China, and the British and the French led to the 1968 Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, ultimately ratified by 187 countries, whose goal it was to limit the spread of nuclear weapons. For further history on it and the reason why it was so successful, please read my book. Now, it defines nuclear weapon states, which denoted a nuclear device developed before January 1st, 1967. Non-nuclear weapon states promised not to manufacture or receive nuclear weapons. Now, obviously, the NATO countries did in fact receive a lot of nuclear weapons, but it was under dual key arrangement, so nominally the warheads were still under American control. Nuclear weapon states must take steps to abolish their nuclear arsenals. And that's sort of a constant issue. Is the US actually planning to get rid of their nuclear weapons? It doesn't seem very active at the moment. States may leave the treaty if the treaty is a threat to the supreme national interest of the country. So it's legal to leave the treaty. And that's exactly what North Korea did, but they were sanctioned anyway. In 1995, the treaty was renegotiated to have an indefinite extension forever. Here you can see nuclear proliferation in 1995 and the declared and the undeclared nuclear weapon states. These are selective nuclear weapons and development sites. You can see on the left we have Dimona in Israel near Beersheba, and there are missile sites near Tel Aviv, and there are other storage sites. And you can see in Iran, Yadz, which is their nuclear reprocessing facility, Isfahan, Kazim, which is a nuclear research center in Iran. And there's a more extensive list in the simulation that comes with this class when you look at the Israel-Iran nuclear facilities. Now, there are a number of non-parties to the agreement. Cuba, India, Israel, Pakistan, and ultimately North Korea left the Non-Proliferation Treaty. India and Pakistan have accused the treaty for decades of being discriminatory by arguing that the focus on horizontal proliferation, basically the spread of nuclear weapons across countries, as opposed to vertical proliferation, which is the increase in the total number of weapons, is wrong. And now most Western analysts believe that this is not a bad trade-off, because when you've got some countries with very large arsenals, they can provide extended deterrence to other countries, and this then stops the spread of nuclear weapons and stops the need to build more nuclear weapons. Here you can see the global nuclear stockpile by the 5 veto powers of the United Nations across different time periods. Now, the International Atomic Energy Agency was created in 1957. It's a UN-affiliated organization with 132 members in Vienna. It is a twofold mission: to facilitate the peaceful use of nuclear energy and implement a system of audits and on-site inspections, safeguards, to verify that nuclear materials and facilities are not being diverted for nuclear weapons. They don't exercise their right to visit every target state. Canada, for example, must submit to an IAEA inspection, but Canada's never been subject to an IAEA inspection. So they generally go where they're suspicious of a violation. Now, under the Non-Proliferation Treaty, non-nuclear weapon states also agree to accept IAEA inspections. So the IAEA has the option of conducting special inspections, which they invoked in the case of Iraq in 1991. The Nuclear Suppliers Group, the NSG, was founded after India's 1974 nuclear test, and its purpose is the regulation and voluntary export control of dual-use technology. So it's a relatively closed group of developed states who had a goal of not allowing nuclear weapons to spread to the developing world. It is believed that newly proliferating states do not have the technology to assure the successful operation of a sophisticated nuclear design, particularly of tactical nuclear weapons and hydrogen bombs, without nuclear testing. So consequently, we have the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, which is a follow-on to the Partial Test Ban Treaty signed in 1963 that prohibited atmospheric testing. The CTBT, the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, banned all nuclear tests and was adopted by the UN General Assembly in 1996. The US Senate rejected its ratification in 1999. Now, obviously, there have been nuclear tests since that, and since the adoption by the General Assembly, and so it raises the issue of the relative legitimacy and importance of the treaty. Here's a graph of global weapons tests, and of course there was a significant decrease in tests because the established thermonuclear powers, England, France, Russia, United States, and China, had basically taken the technology as far as they thought was necessary, especially since the Cold War was winding down. Now, this is the reason to conduct tests, which is that you can significantly improve and make smaller, miniaturize the warhead by applying high technology. So a low-tech weapon from very low yield up to 100 kiloton is going to need at least a 6 kilogram highly enriched uranium mass warhead. You can see with medium technology you can significantly reduce that down to maybe 3 kilograms. And with high tech you can cut that in half, even for some of the largest bombs. So there is significant advantage to continued research and development. We can see this applied on an even smaller scale with plutonium warheads. You can get some incredibly small warheads, although you see here the medium tech and low tech, or rather the medium tech and high tech, doesn't quite give the same improvement because the plutonium warheads are already very small. At precisely 53 Greenwich Mean Time on September 22, 1979, an American advanced Vela satellite launched on May 23, 1969 observed 2 closely spaced flashes of light localized in the Indian Ocean in the vicinity of South Africa's Prince Edward Island. The Vela system had detected 41 previous atmospheric tests. It was believed that South Africa facilitated an Israeli test at the site. There has been no independent verification of that test, even though the island has been accessible to visits. You can see here on the left the US Vela satellite, and you can also see preparations for an underground nuclear test that were being organized, probably in the United States. Now, the MTCR is the Missile Technology Control Regime, and it was formed in 1987, and it was an informal agreement to control the export of missiles with a range of over 300 kilometers and a payload of over 300 kilograms. So it's essentially an attempt to limit even medium-range missiles with nuclear capability. Here you can see a US Thor missile being transported by a special aircraft. These are the different missile ranges. You can see here missiles of interest: Israel's Jericho-2, the CSS-2, which is deployed in Saudi Arabia. You can see the Nodong and the Taepodong in North Korea, but this chart is, again, 2 decades old, and the missiles, particularly the Agni series from India, now have a much longer range. Now, U.S. grand strategy with regard to nuclear proliferation has been to assure the spread of democracy more quickly, in the belief that democracies were less likely to produce security problems, which is a principal reason for why nuclear weapons proliferate. But this bogged down in the 1990s. The Israeli anti-proliferation policy has always been preventative, to attack. In 1981, Israel attacked and destroyed the Iraqi Osirak reactor, and then agents destroyed the Tammuz reactor with explosives in France, and the French then decided not to continue sales to Iraq. Israel considered attacking Pakistan's nuclear assets in 1979, but were generally deterred with its low probability of success. In the early 1990s, Sam Brown at the Rand Corporation and others began looking at a U.S. preemption strategy to deal with emerging threats in the post-Cold War period. The Bush policy evolved from this debate in the early 1990s. Here you can see a map of North Korea's nuclear facilities, which you're going to see in a simulation in this course. And you see here also a permissive action link controller, which is a technology used to dial in whether a nuclear weapon could be deployed or not. This is a list of preventative attacks against nuclear, biological, chemical programs, and you'll see at the very top in 1942 British commandos against the German nuclear program in Norway, and this was done several times. And this was the Norsk plant, which was producing deuterium for nuclear weapons research in Germany. Here you can see the path the Israeli aircraft took. The aircraft here were dependent on tankers. So they basically had to fly out to their target. They hit the reactor in Iraq and they came back by flying over Jordan and Saudi Arabia. Here is the actual reactor, the Osirak reactor in Iraq after it had been demolished. And take a look at this map for a moment. It'll be of some use when you get to class.